Hi guys, welcome to this month's Real English video where I take you around the city of Edinburgh, tell you some fascinating history, and you get a great English lesson at the same time. So today we are continuing our story of Mary Queen of Scots. Let's go. So welcome to our second video on Mary Queen of Scots. If you didn't see our first one, I'd definitely go and check that out first. But here's a quick recap of what we talked about. So by the age of 18, the Catholic Mary had become Queen of France, been widowed, and moved back to Scotland, a newly Protestant country. Meanwhile, Mary's cousin, Elizabeth I, had become Queen of England. Mary's de Guise uncles had deliberately been antagonising England by saying that Mary had a better claim to the English throne. Mary asked Elizabeth to name her heir to the English throne, but Elizabeth never made a decision and just kept quiet on the matter. Mary then remarried again a man called Lord Darnley, who turned out to be an arrogant drunk and a murderer, who killed her best friend in front of her, stabbing him 57 times. Mary then gave birth to her son, James VI of Scotland, giving Scotland a male heir to the throne and potentially England too. Darnley got the Protestant lords who had previously rebelled against Mary to come back to Scotland, thinking it might help him actually get Mary's crown. It did not. Instead, what happened is that Darnley died in an explosion. In other words, he was murdered at Kirk-of-Fields. No burn marks were found on the body, however he had been suffocated. So that's where we're at with Mary. Now let me tell you the rest of her amazing story. So the second part of Mary's story starts with a new character, James Hepburn, or the 4th Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell had been a big supporter of Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, and had also become a trusted friend of Mary. But first, I think you guys might like to know a little background to his character. So Bothwell had been engaged and possibly even married to a Norwegian noblewoman. After asking this woman to sell all of her possessions and ask her family for money, he abandoned her in Flanders. He then came back to Scotland and married Lady Jean Gordon. But they got divorced on the 7th of May 1567 because of his adultery with her servant Bessie Crawford. As you can see, not exactly good husband material. But thanks to Mary's terrible taste in men, that's what he became. Although in fairness to Mary, this time he wasn't really her choice. So this is how the story of Bothwell and Mary generally goes. Mary and Bothwell were both lovers, and it was Bothwell who had murdered Darnley at Kirk-of-Fields in order to be able to claim Mary as his bride. Mary didn't allow any evidence at his trial so that he could be acquitted, and then they got married, proving that it had been a passionate love affair after all. Mary quickly got pregnant with twins, showing that the marriage had been consummated. All of this greatly angered the Protestant lords, again, forcing them to rise up against the Queen, and Mary and Bothwell ultimately lost their battle against them. It forced them to leave the country. Mary had to abdicate her throne, and in the process, she miscarried her twins. But this isn't what actually happened. Mary and Bothwell were both manipulated by the Protestant lairds and William Cecil, Elizabeth I's political advisor. They orchestrated a smear campaign to convince the public that Bothwell and Mary had been having an affair and that together they had murdered Lord Darnley. The end goal of this was to get the Earl of Moray, Mary's half-brother and a Protestant, on the throne. It was clear that Mary would never consent to divorcing Darnley because it would affect her son's right to the throne. So the lords who advised her decided that the best solution to this was just to get Darnley killed. They persuaded Bothwell to do it, but because he was a loyal supporter of Mary, they really had to sweeten the deal. And they said that if he did it, he would then go on to marry Mary and become king consort, essentially ruling Scotland. They made sure that the public would want to condemn them too, and they did this by posting posters all over Edinburgh. On the posters, there was a mermaid sitting on top of a hare. Now, to you and me, that might not mean anything, but to the people of Edinburgh, it definitely did. The mermaid was meant to represent Mary, but mermaids were also symbolic of prostitutes, and the hare was Bothwell's crest. The people of Edinburgh would definitely have known what was being suggested. The next important step in the plan was getting Mary to marry Bothwell, because that would prove that they'd been having this passionate affair. However, here there was a spanner in the works, because Mary refused. Bothwell solved this problem, however, by abducting her 4 days later and taking her to the village of Dunbar. There, he persuaded her that they needed to be married for their mutual security. However, to make it even more complicated, Bothwell wasn't actually divorced yet. So that meant that they needed to consummate their future marriage to add claim, because she could potentially be pregnant. It's also suggested by a lot of historians that this was not consensual, and that Mary was in fact raped. A group of Protestant lairds called the Confederates immediately took up arms against Mary and Bothwell. But this was also part of the plan too. They let Bothwell escape Scotland, because if he had been put on trial, this entire conspiracy would have come out. Mary, however, was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, and there she was forced to abdicate and hand her throne over to her infant son. She was told that this was to help her preserve her dignity so that she wouldn't have to face trial. Of course, it's again more likely that if Mary had gone to trial again, the truth would have come out. The Protestant plotters had been successful. They got rid of their Catholic queen and put the infant Protestant king on the throne. Mary managed to escape Lochleven, however, and went straight to England, thinking that her cousin Elizabeth I would help her, a fellow queen, to get back her throne. She was wrong. Elizabeth continued to sit on the fence. Elizabeth ordered something called a commission of inquiry to determine whether Mary was actually guilty of murdering Darnley. But as an anointed queen, Mary refused. The commission went on, however, and the Earl of Moray, Mary's Protestant half-brother, presented the infamous Casket Letters. These letters showed that Mary had been having an affair with Bothwell, and that they had both been involved in the murder. Mary, of course, denied writing them and said they were forgeries. We still don't know today if they were or not, but personally, given all we know about the plotting behind Mary's marriage to Bothwell, I would think they probably were. Unfortunately for Mary, after examining the handwriting and comparing it with Mary's own handwriting, a majority of the commissioners at the trial decided the letters were real. However, all of this had just been a kind of political exercise. Elizabeth had never had any intention of actually delivering a verdict. In the end, the Earl of Moray returned to Scotland as regent, and Mary remained in custody in England. She'd stay there for the next 17 years. Mary was imprisoned in various castles and houses around England and also implicated in a number of plots as well. Elizabeth, however, continued to stay on the fence. Although she wouldn't release Mary, she wouldn't condemn her either. When the English Parliament passed a bill barring Mary from the throne, Elizabeth refused to give it royal assent. Mary tried everything that she could think of to gain her freedom. This included begging her son, who she hadn't seen in 17 years, for help. She was willing to give up her throne, to give up all of her principles just for her freedom. However, James refused. He'd never really known his mother and had been raised to believe that she was a traitor. Instead of agreeing to help Mary, he signed an alliance treaty with Elizabeth, abandoning his mother. Mary's final undoing, though, was the Babington Plot. This was the final conspiracy that did end up implicating her. Letters were intercepted that showed that Mary was conspiring to dethrone Elizabeth. Although there's evidence to suggest that she was manipulated into doing this, her final downfall was a letter which she definitely did sign, saying, "Let the plot commence." Mary was tried, found guilty and sentenced to death, despite her protests that she couldn't be tried because she wasn't an English subject. Elizabeth, however, hesitated in signing the death warrant, and she had some really valid reasons for doing that. Executing a queen set a precedent, and Elizabeth didn't like the possible consequences of that. She also strongly believed, like Mary, in the divine right to rule. Despite that, Elizabeth eventually did sign Mary's death warrant on the 1st of February 1587. Her execution is stuff of legend. When the executioner asked her for his forgiveness, as was typical at the time, Mary replied, "I forgive you with all my heart, for now I hope you will make an end of all my troubles." She dressed in crimson brown, the Catholic colour of martyrdom, and her last words were, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." It took 3 strikes to cut off her head, and when the executioner finally picked it up, her famous red hair stayed in his hand while her head rolled away. Mary had been wearing a wig. Her incredible red hair had turned grey from so many years of imprisonment. All her clothing, the block, and anything touched by her blood was burnt to avoid it being taken as relics. When the news reached Elizabeth, she was furious, insisting that she had never actually signed the death warrant. Elizabeth's vagueness and indecision allowed her to avoid being directly responsible for Mary's death. Or, perhaps, she was genuinely upset. But Mary kind of had the last laugh. Elizabeth I died with no heirs, meaning that Mary's son, King James VI of Scotland, became heir to the English throne as King James I. Through King James, we saw the union of the crowns, and this would fundamentally change Scotland's history forever. But that's another story for another time, guys. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss a video, and we'll see you next time.